Chicago always seemed to wake up under a veil of damp gray. But that Tuesday carried a heaviness even the air could not disguise. I sat at the small oak table in my townhouse near the river, the steam of my silver needle tea rising in delicate threads. My tablet glowed with Atlas's overnight updates, contracts cross-referenced, compliance deadlines flagged, litigation risks projected with clinical precision. The hum of that system was the closest thing I had to a heartbeat outside my own. Atlas was more than code. 20 years earlier, I had built it brick by brick with James Sterling, the founder of Sterling Kale Energy. He used to joke that while his engineers drilled into the ground for fuel, I had mined the law for its buried power. Together, we shaped Atlas not just as a database, but as a sentry, a fortress of logic and foresight. James believed in structures that could outlast human frailty. The screen flickered. A new line of text appeared in my encrypted inbox. No sender, just the message. Be careful today. He's planning something against you. My pulse quickened, though my face remained still. The warning could only have come from someone deep inside Eat, a loyal engineer who had seen something and risked everything to tell me. I set the tablet aside and lifted my porcelain cup. The grassy bitterness of the tea steadied me. Ritual mattered. Even as shadows gathered, I refused to surrender the habits that defined me. By the time I stepped outside, rain had turned the city into a watercolor of steel and glass. My umbrella caught the gusts as I made my way to the tower on Wacker Drive. I rehearsed neutrality in every step. Inside the lobby, I nodded to the doorman, though he seemed too preoccupied to meet my gaze. The elevator doors opened, polished steel reflecting my composed expression. As I pressed the button for the 48th floor, I felt the warning settle deeper, like a stone in my chest. Somewhere above, Ethan Sterling was waiting, and I needed to know what shape his plan would take. The elevator chimed and opened onto the 48th floor, where glass walls framed the Chicago River like a shifting ribbon of silver. Workhouse and my office waited at the end of the corridor. Exactly as I had left it the night before, shelves of first edition legal texts lined in quiet order, my porcelain teacup locked safely in its cabinet, the low hum of the servers whispering through the walls like a pulse. It was a sanctuary I had curated over 2 decades, each detail chosen to anchor me amid chaos. The calm shattered with the sound of my door opening without so much as a knock. Ethan Sterling strode in, radiating the confidence of a man who had never known the price of failure. His suit was sleek, Italian, tailored to impress, but it hung slightly off his shoulders, as if the fabric knew it was draped over a boy pretending to be king. "Laura," he began, skipping any greeting. "We need to synergize our verticals and circle back on the Q3 pivot. Deliverables must be actionized." His words tumbled out in a word salad he mistook for leadership. I reached into my drawer and placed a neatly bound 50-page report on the desk between us. "If you're referring to the Aerodyne merger," I said evenly, "you'll find every point of exposure detailed here. 17 in total, each supported by Atlas's predictive models." He didn't even glance at the pages. Instead, he smirked. "Paranoia. That's your problem, always trapped in the rearview mirror. We're a rocket ship now, and risk is just opportunity in disguise." I let his words settle, noting them as I always did, another shard of recklessness cataloged. He'd already stripped me of my weekly board briefings, reassigned my parking space to a 24-year-old visionary officer, and christened my office the museum. Each insult seemed trivial alone, but they were paper cuts all the same, cuts that bled into a pattern Atlas recorded with perfect clarity. I folded my hands calmly on the desk, watching Ethan fill the space with bluster, and thought of how thin even the finest fabric becomes when it's stretched too far. At 10 o'clock sharp, I stepped into the main conference room. The air was heavy with the sour scent of stale coffee and unease. Men I had worked beside for decades shifted in their seats, twirling pens, avoiding my eyes as if guilt itself could be contagious. The long mahogany table gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and my presentation glowed on the main screen. I spoke with the precision that 20 years of discipline had forged. Atlas's models laid out the truth with merciless clarity, a 72% chance of class action litigation within 18 months, a tangle of undisclosed SEC inquiries, and nearly $1 billion in projected liabilities if the Aerodyne merger went forward. Each chart, each data point was an iron nail hammered into the coffin of this reckless deal. When I finished, silence clamped down on the room. For a moment, I thought reason might still hold. Then Ethan's laugh cut through the air, short and sharp, like glass breaking. He reached across the table, lifted my report between two fingers as though it were diseased, and let it fall into the wastebasket with deliberate contempt. "This," he sneered, eyes blazing with theatrical triumph, "is exactly the kind of analog thinking that has held Sterling Kale back. We're a rocket ship, Laura, and we don't have room for anchors." The words landed harder than any shout could have. Before I could reply, he straightened his tie and delivered the final blow. "Your services are no longer required. Security will escort you out." The guards appeared at the door, silent but firm. Around the table, the board's faces drained of color, yet none of them spoke. Not one man who had leaned on me for decades rose to intervene. I gathered my briefcase, smoothed the front of my jacket, and nodded once. My dignity was the only thing they could not confiscate. As the guards opened the door, I walked out, each step measured, already calculating what shape my silence would need to take next. Rain streaked across the taxi window, turning the Chicago skyline into a smear of steel and light. I leaned back against the cracked leather seat, the faint scent of wet asphalt seeping through the vents. Oddly, I felt no anger, no grief, only a cold, clarifying calm that cut sharper than rage ever could. The paper cuts were finished. Now it was time for surgery. I reached into my bag and pulled out a slim black tablet, unmarked, its surface unremarkable to anyone but me. My thumb unlocked it, revealing a stark screen with a single icon, a balance scale etched in pale blue. The app bore a name only James Sterling and I had ever spoken aloud: Covenant. My mind slipped back to a rainy afternoon more than a decade ago. James and I had been in his study, shelves crowded with old maps and oil paintings of rigs long retired. He'd poured us 2 cups of Darjeeling tea and spoken with a gravity I'd only heard once before, on the day his wife died. "Laura," he'd said, "Ethan is bright, but arrogance can blind a man faster than darkness. If he ever puts ego above the company, I need to know Atlas will defend itself." Together we had written the safeguard into Atlas's core, a clause of silicon and code disguised as routine architecture. If I were ever terminated without a 2/3 board vote, Atlas would register the act as hostile treason. The response would be absolute transfer of controlling interest to me, the designated guardian. It was James's last insurance policy, one he trusted only me to hold. Now, with the city blurred beyond the glass, I tapped the icon. The screen asked for biometric confirmation. My right thumb pressed against the glass, cool as stone. A green pulse shimmered. Protocol engaged. Final, irrevocable. I closed the tablet and slipped it back into my bag, a small smile touching the edge of my mouth. Somewhere high above, in an office that once belonged to his father, Ethan believed he had won. He had no idea the machine was already awake. By morning, The storm had shifted from the streets of Chicago to the marble floors of Sterling Kale. I imagine the scene as I sip my tea from home employees rushing in, faces pale, voices tight with unease. Somewhere on the 48th floor, Ethan was arriving late, as he often did, sliding his Porsche into the executive garage like a trophy no one admired. The first blow struck when he tried to log into Atlas. Access denied. He would have refreshed the screen, tried another password, then slammed his palm against the desk when the message repeated itself. For the first time, his credentials carried no weight. By 9 o'clock, it was in full panic. Teams crowded into glass-walled rooms, cables and laptops scattered like broken shields. They had no way in. Only I held the master key, and Atlas didn't recognize Ethan as anything more than a trespasser. Then the system spread its reach. International payments froze across 37 countries. Contracts locked, sealed in digital vaults. Acquisition pipelines shut down midstream. Sterling Kale's global machinery stuttered to a halt. At 10:15, a deeper twist unfurled one James and I had designed on a rainy afternoon much like this. Atlas sent automated notices to the SEC and to major banking partners across New York, London, and Zurich. Each alert flagged irregular activity, warning regulators and financiers that Sterling Kale's integrity was compromised. It was the company's own nervous system confessing its illness to the world. Inside the tower, whispers spread. Assistants leaned close in corridors, murmuring my name like a spell. Laura did this. She planned it. Fear mixed with a strange admiration, some even smiled behind closed doors. Ethan pounded his desk hard enough for the sound to echo down the hall. His empire was crumbling, not with fire or noise, but with silence and locked doors. Each furious call he made went unanswered. Every demand returned only with confusion. And while the skyscraper shook with chaos, I remained in my townhouse, steady and unhurried, watching the storm I had released take its first shape. The rain had thinned by afternoon, leaving the windows streaked with rivulets that caught the pale light. I sat at the kitchen table with my porcelain cup, the scent of silver needle tea filling the townhouse with its quiet, grassy calm. The chaos downtown felt distant here, as though the city's panic belonged to another life. The front door creaked open and Emily's voice carried down the hall. Mom. She appeared in the doorway, cheeks flushed from the cold, a notebook tucked under her arm. Even in her 20s, she still had that same resolute set to her chin that reminded me of her father. She placed her things on the counter and looked at me with eyes that had been sharpened by deadlines and headlines. "Did you really do this?" she asked. "The markets are buzzing. Everyone's talking about some secret protocol. Traders are panicking. My editor sent me to confirm the rumor." I sipped my tea and let the warmth linger before I spoke. Rumors have their uses. Sometimes they tell you more about fear than about facts. Emily folded her arms, impatient. "But did you—" I met her gaze. "Integrity isn't about what people accuse you of, Emily. It's about what survives when the shouting fades. A company, a legacy, even a family, they're built on choices. Some choices are quiet, some are heavy, but they define us more than any rumor ever could." Her shoulders softened, the edge of her reporter's skepticism giving way to the daughter who had grown up watching me pore over contracts late into the night. I reached for her hand across the table. "I worked so you could have choices I never had. And sometimes that meant carrying burdens you weren't meant to see." Emily blinked back a sheen of tears, then nodded slowly. "Everyone thinks silence means surrender," she murmured. "No," I said, giving her hand a gentle squeeze. "Silence is a weapon if you know when to use it." The clock in the hall struck 4, its chime steady. marking the moment before the storm outside my walls returned in the form of Ethan himself. The storm returned in the evening, this time carried on 2 fists that pounded against my townhouse door. Before I could rise, it swung open, and Ethan stumbled in, soaked through, his expensive suit clinging to him like a punishment. His hair dripped onto the hardwood floor, and his face burned with a fury that made him look less like a leader and more like a child caught in the wrong. "You've destroyed everything," he shouted, his voice hoarse with rage. "The company is frozen, the stock halted, the board panicking. This is your doing. Admit it." I didn't flinch. Instead, I turned to my desk, opened my laptop, and let the glow fill the room. On the screen was a single document, familiar to me, down to the last character. The digital parchment bore the embossed signature of James Sterling, verified and authenticated, a decade old but eternal in its authority. Ethan's steps faltered as he approached. He leaned closer, eyes narrowing against the light. His voice cracked when he whispered, "What is this?" "Your father's insurance policy," I said evenly. His gaze darted across the clauses he'd never known existed. The words spelled out the covenant if I were dismissed without full board consent. Atlas would treat it as corporate treason and reassign control. It was all there, immutable and binding. I watched his confidence drain as though someone had cut a vein. The proud set of his shoulders slumped, his jaw quivered, and the fire in his eyes guttered into disbelief. For the first time since he inherited the chair, Ethan Sterling was confronted by a truth he could not laugh away, insult, or ignore. "This isn't possible," he muttered, shaking his head. "It's more than possible," I replied, my tone soft but unyielding. "It's the foundation your father left behind. He saw what you might become, and he built walls stronger than your ego." Ethan staggered back, drenched and silent, staring at the glowing proof that had just dismantled his inheritance. And as he tried to gather words, the summons for the emergency board meeting was already waiting for both of us. 2 days later, I returned to the same conference room where my execution had been staged. The stale coffee smell was the same, but the atmosphere had shifted. This time, I did not walk in as a dismissed relic. I entered as majority shareholder and acting chairwoman. The weight of silence followed me to the head of the table, where I set my briefcase down without haste. Ethan was already there. His face was gray, eyes ringed with sleepless shadows, his once practiced smirk absent. The board members looked between us, their fear sharper now, not of me, but of the truth they knew was coming. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, my voice steady. "Atlas has initiated a forensic audit of all discretionary spending and consultancy contracts under Mr. Sterling's tenure. At my signal, the screen behind me flickered alive. Atlas projected a lattice of accounts, payments, and shell corporations. Lines connected names to entities, entities to invoices, invoices to nothing but empty addresses. In red, anomalies pulsed like wounds on the body of the company. The evidence unraveled without theatrics, millions funneled to Ethan's college friends under false consultancy agreements, payments to a PR firm that never existed, inflated invoices for advisory services that were nothing more than siphoned funds. It was a trail drawn in his own careless hand, mapped with the cold precision only Atlas could provide. The board sat rigid as the network expanded across the screen, each revelation striking harder than the last. Ethan's breathing quickened, his hands clenched into fists on the table. But he said nothing. His voice, once loud enough to drown out reason, had collapsed under the weight of irrefutable code. When the final projection faded, silence reclaimed the room, one by one. The directors raised their hands. The vote was unanimous termination for cause, without severance, without shield. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I let Atlas speak for me. Its clinical clarity louder than any vengeance could ever be. As the gavel struck the table, I knew the next step was not punishment, but restoration. The morning after the vote, I stepped once more onto the 48th floor. The quiet greeted me like an old friend. My office door opened without resistance, and everything was exactly as I remembered. The rows of first editions, the porcelain cup in its locked cabinet, the low hum of Atlas breathing through the servers. I filled the kettle, measured the familiar silver leaves, and let the aroma of my tea rise to reclaim the air. The faint trace of Ethan's cologne had vanished, burned away by time and consequence. I walked the corridor alone, each step echoing in a space that now belonged wholly to me, the conference room. Once the stage of my humiliation had already been stripped of its old nameplate. In its place, I unveiled a new bronze plaque, its weight solid in my hands. I fixed it to the wall just outside the doors. The engraving, catching the morning light, integrity is the only asset that can't be bought. It must be defended at all costs. Inside, the long table gleamed under polished lights. I stood at the head, fingers grazing the smooth surface where Ethan had once sneered, where the board had once turned their eyes away. Now it was quiet, dignified. No longer a theater for spectacle, but a room restored to purpose. I breathed deeply, letting the silence fill me. For the first time in years, my chest expanded without restraint. The floor was mine again, not through inheritance or politics, but through endurance and the simple power of truth. Returning to my office, I poured the tea into my cup, its porcelain warm against my palms. Outside the window, the river cut a silver line through the city, steady, unbroken. I had reclaimed more than a title or a seat. I had restored the promise James Sterling made when he trusted me with Atlas, that the company would always serve integrity above all. As I sat at my desk, steam rising in a soft curl, I knew the kingdom was whole again, waiting for its next chapter to be written. By evening, the city had shed its gray skin and dressed itself in light. From my office window, the Chicago River shimmered under a canopy of glittering towers, each reflection dancing like sparks across the water. The building's hum was steady, unbroken, a rhythm of order restored. Atlas pulsed quietly in the background, its servers purring with the contentment of a system once again aligned with its true purpose. I leaned back in my chair, the porcelain cup warm in my hands, the scent of silver needle tea wrapping the room in calm. For 2 decades, this place had been both battlefield and sanctuary, a stage where silence had been mistaken for weakness and where arrogance had mistaken itself for power. Now, only the steady breath of machines and the quiet tick of the clock remained. My phone lit up beside me. A message from Emily, proud of you. Mom. I read it twice. Then once more, letting the words anchor me in a way no board vote or corporate title ever could. She had seen me weather storms without breaking, had questioned my silence, and now she understood. That was victory greater than any contract signed or deal secured. I turned back to the plaque I had installed outside the conference room that morning, its inscription echoing in my mind. Integrity is the only asset that can't be bought. It must be defended at all costs. It wasn't just a reminder for the directors or for employees. It was for me, too. A vow I had kept even when the world looked away. I hadn't simply regained my office or my authority. I had inherited the kingdom James Sterling had intended me to guard. A kingdom not built on ego or inheritance, but on memory, discipline, and truth. I closed my eyes for a moment, listening to the quiet thrum of Atlas, the nervous system of Sterling Kale at peace. Power isn't loud. It's the silent functioning of a promise kept.